I've been working as a freelance wildlife filmmaker and content creator full-time for the past 3 years now. And one of my most frequently asked questions is about my career path and what I did to get here. So in this video, I'm going to cover everything I did from college up until most recently, all about the choices that I made in terms of A-levels to what I did at university to what I do now, and hopefully provide you a bit of insight for anyone looking to follow a similar path. I just wanted to start by saying that although this is my personal path, there are so many different ways to get into this industry. All of my friends have completely different backgrounds in terms of how they got to be a wildlife filmmaker. So if you're further along in your path and you may not have made these choices earlier on, it's totally fine. Like, there are loads of different routes into the industry, and this is just what I personally did to get where I am today. Okay, so starting with A-levels, because this is kind of the first time where you can choose what you want to do for yourself rather than things set by school. So growing up, I always had two passions. I always loved animals and science, but I also loved dancing. So my A-levels really reflected this. So in terms of science, I did biology A-level, but other than that, it wasn't science related at all. I did dance, drama, and English literature. This meant that for most zoology courses that I was applying for, it was totally fine because you only had to have one science, but there were some universities that I couldn't apply for because I didn't have chemistry. So just bearing that in mind in terms of what universities you're looking into, just to making sure that when you are choosing your A-levels, you're kind of thinking about what you want to do next and making sure that they align with that in terms of your career path. When I started college, I also started volunteering, so I was getting hands-on experience with animals alongside my studies. My first place of volunteering was at Diana Brimblecombe Animal Rescue Centre, and I would go there once a week on my day off of college to help with the dogs, cats, rabbits, all of which were given up by previous owners and looking for new homes. So that was kind of like complementing my studies, making sure that I had like the hands-on practical experience as well as what I was learning whilst I was still doing my A-levels at college. And I carried this through for, I'd say, the first 5 years of my career, like making sure that I was still volunteering alongside any studies or anything else that I was doing. And that was really key for me in shaping my field skills as well as like the more knowledge-based skills that I was getting while studying as well. So after college, I had got a place to go to Oxford University to study biological sciences, but this was a conditional offer based on my grades. And I actually missed out on this place by just 1 mark, and they still wouldn't let me in. And at the time, I remember being like so disappointed in myself and feeling like this whole path that I'd kind of chosen for myself wasn't working out. But then I feel like everything happens for a reason. I decided to take my second place offer, which was at Leeds. So I went to study at Leeds for 3 years doing a BSc in zoology. And because of where I then ended up studying, they offered a study abroad year, which I never would have got if I had gone down the Oxford route. And actually, I took up this offer and went to Australia for a year to study at the University of Queensland in Brisbane. And this was just like the most incredible experience because I was out in nature all the time. I was surrounded by incredible wildlife. All of my lessons there were much more immersive and field-based. And I think that really shaped what I decided that I wanted to do next. And I think sometimes, you know, when I was younger and I got that grades through and I thought like, oh, this isn't what I want, but actually everything happens for a reason. And it's important to remember that even though we are on this path, like paths can change and deviate, but just remembering that basically everything happens for a reason. So yeah, I did my study abroad year in Brisbane, and then I went back to Leeds for my final year. And this is when I did my dissertation. At the time, I really loved animal behaviour, and I thought I wanted to do more field-based work after graduating. So I did a study on social learning and pack structure in African painted dogs. And that was kind of the final thing I did in terms of my undergrad, and I graduated with a first-class degree in zoology. Shortly after that, I got a job up in Scotland working as a wildlife guide, and this was kind of my first paid job in the conservation world. And I was going out every day on the boat, leading whale watching tours, although we very rarely saw the whales, so it was pointing out other wildlife like otters, dolphins, eagles, all of the incredible wildlife up in Scotland. And at this time, I got my first camera, which was just a second-hand camera off eBay, and I absolutely fell in love with photography. Because I was out in the field all the time for work, I just started sharing what I was doing online very informally with like no goal for it to really lead anywhere, more just because I was like, hey, this is cool, I want to share this with my friends and anyone else that's interested in wildlife. And kind of through doing that, soon began to build up a community of other people that were also doing similar things. And that's kind of how I learned more about wildlife filmmaking as a career, and that it was even an option to kind of pursue that as a career path. So after I'd been working for a year, I decided to go along to something called Wildscreen, which is a wildlife filmmaking festival that happens every other year in Bristol. And through this, I met a lot of people that had just come off of a master's course, which was a master's in wildlife filmmaking run by the University of the West of England in collaboration with the BBC. And I decided at that point that it was something that I wanted to apply for, because although I was kind of out enjoying taking pictures, I didn't really have a clue about how to tell stories and how to tell stories about wildlife specifically. So I applied for this master's, and then the following September got a place and joined the course. The nice thing about the course is that it's really small. It's only a group of about 15 people, and everyone comes from a completely different path, which is what I was kind of saying earlier in the video, that there's not one fixed route into this industry. There are people of completely mixed ages from places all around the world. Some people had a master's already. Some people were coming from zoology or science backgrounds like myself, but some people were more anthropology, geography, or completely unrelated professions. So it was a total mix of people, which really does reinforce the fact that you can do anything to still be aligned with the path of a wildlife filmmaker. It's more about your passion for storytelling more than anything else. So I decided to go and do the Masters, and I got, I think, 6 months through the Masters before the pandemic happened. And then all of the plans that I kind of had for the Masters, for the film that I wanted to make, kind of went out the window. And it was kind of a moment of being forced to kind of reevaluate in terms of what next. I feel like through the Masters, I gained a lot of really valuable skills in terms of how to tell stories, how a production team works, the kind of like the behind the scenes part of the industry and the workings of it that you don't really see when you're watching a documentary. But what I felt like I didn't get enough of was kind of like hands-on camera experience. So for me, the time that we had off was kind of a blessing in disguise, because I actually had some loan kit out from university that I was then unable to give back because the university had closed. And basically every day in my parents' garden, I would just go out with a camera and film bunnies, film birds, and basically just start teaching myself how to film wildlife. And it quickly became something that I was obsessed with, like actually the camera work rather than the kind of production team side of things. And that's kind of when I shifted to be like, actually, instead of being part of the team making these wildlife programs, I actually want to be a camera woman working on filming these shows for myself. So kind of alongside all of this, I started working as a researcher at Silverback Films, which is like a big production company in Bristol. I was working on their Earthshot Prize series for the first year that I was with them. But alongside this, I was getting more freelance opportunities from sharing on social media. So I got my first kind of good paid collaborations at that time. The first one was with Lumix, and the second one was with Jack Wolfskin, and then I started to get more opportunities after that. So kind of working full time for a production company, but still doing little bits of part-time work alongside that through sharing my own camera work on social media. For the final deliverable for the Masters, you have to submit a final film. And because of the pandemic and the fact that we kind of were off on our own, we were basically told that at any point in the future, you can send in a final film. So the following summer, I took 5 days off work for Silverback and went to make a film about a woman called Amira and a group called the Wonderless Women, all about diversity in the outdoors. And I filmed this just in the Lake District in the UK. And this film was kind of the opportunity to really tell a full story for myself for the first time and work with a group of amazing women to tell a story that was really important to me. I feel like making that film and having the opportunity to submit it to film festivals, which it did well in a couple of them, gave me the confidence that I needed to leave my job and the security of that and pursue wildlife filmmaking as a full-time career, just completely independently. So in April 2022, that's when I decided to leave my job at Silverback and fully commit to being freelance, which I was absolutely terrified of. And lots of my family thought I was crazy to have gotten this job that I'd like dreamed about for a long time to then be leaving it. But I was kind of at that point where it was difficult to manage anyway, because I was getting freelance work through my social media anyway, and I couldn't juggle everything. So it was kind of like, that was the right time to make that shift for me. But I would say I personally wouldn't have felt comfortable unless I had the stability of a couple of long-term clients to know that, okay, at the bare minimum, I can at least cover my rent and my bills and everything else that I needed to pay before making that shift. So it's not like I just went in blind as a freelancer. It was kind of at the point where I felt financially comfortable to make that shift that I decided to do that as a full-time path. So I've now been fully freelance for 3 years, and basically I work with different brands to produce content all focused about wildlife and the outdoors. There's a few different ways in which I work with brands. Sometimes it's content, most of the time it's content that sits on my own platform, but sometimes it will be a commission to create something for someone else that they can have usage rights to. I'd say especially at the start, a lot of my time was spent doing outreach, coming up with ideas for pictures and thinking of brands that would naturally align with those. But now I'd say it's more of an organic process where I have some long-term clients that I have work with year after year, or just people that I work with repeatedly, or it's just become a thing that through my social media following, which has now grown, I just get more incoming work that way. So it has kind of been a process, and also a lot of learning in terms of, I think, self-confidence, because you go from this shift from being within a system of being at school, at college, being employed, to being totally on my own. I do everything on my own most of the time. Sometimes if I'm really busy, I'll hire someone to help with an edit or second camera work, but most of the time I do everything from research, pre-production, to shooting, editing, pitching to brands, the whole process. So as someone that may have done a couple of things before, it took a lot for me to learn, okay, what's a fair rate to be setting? How do I negotiate that with the client? How do I make sure that I'm signing a contract that's like got my best interest at heart? And there has been a big learning process that has come with that. But I'd say, especially in the last year, I'm a lot more confident with it than I was before. But I think for me personally, that was kind of the biggest struggle, because I went into this because ultimately I love animals, I love spending time in nature, I love being outdoors with my camera, so the business side of things was what I struggled with the most. But that's something I think that's much easier for people to learn than having that like passion that's going to drive you forwards no matter what. So for me, I always try to work with a brand that aligns with my ethos and my values and feels like something that would be organically part of that process, rather than something that feels forced or that brand is brought in it just to have the commission made. So I always try and think about, okay, what's the story and how can that brand fit into the idea naturally? Obviously with like my camera kit, it's a bit easy because I'm using that in the field all the time, and I'm now working with Nikon as a long-term sponsor. Same for outdoor clothing. Obviously, I need to wear outdoor clothing wherever I am in the field, and I've been working with Jack Wolfskin for the past 4 years now, actually. So stuff like that is easy because it fits in organically. So I think it's more when I have like a more product-focused collaboration is thinking, okay, how can I tie this in with a story? So kind of some notable examples is that I had a commission with Lenovo to make a film about the exotic pet trade, specifically about gibbons and how social media is impacting the exotic pet trade of gibbons. And this is kind of a way in which I feel like the story and the brand aligned really well, because social media was a key part of that story. You couldn't tell that story without talking about social media. So the phone and bringing in a device into that story was really natural. It didn't feel forced in any way. So those are the kind of collaborations that I really like working on. Similarly, last year I got to go to Uganda to do the gorilla trekking with Vivo Barefoot, who are a brand that I've used for many, many years after having foot surgeries from all of my years growing up dancing. So it was a brand that I already believed in, already used myself, and it kind of slotted in naturally rather than being like, hey, here's a product, can you try it? And it's not something that I may support or believe in, and it just fits in that way. So I think especially in the whole nature space, it needs to feel like it's fitting in organically rather than something that feels more forced. And that's always been something that's been really important to me, rather than accepting or pitching to anyone and everyone, really going back to what's important and thinking about what aligns naturally and organically, and only working with brands that feel in alignment with myself and my values. I also think it's really important to diversify your income streams, so not always relying on brand work to pay your bills. Obviously, that can be through ad revenue, like platforms like YouTube and even TikTok now do pay creators. Instagram, I believe, do in the US, but not here yet in the UK, but I'm guessing that will change soon. But there are other ways that as a creative you can earn money. For example, print sales. You could set up a Patreon. I personally run group trips a couple of times a year where I take out guests on safaris and teach them all about wildlife photography or filmmaking in the real world. And that's always incredible, not just in terms of working, but just being able to share my passion with others, because it's always a group of like-minded people who love animals, love being outside in nature, love using cameras. So that's always really fun. I also do talks sometimes. I take on editing jobs. Sometimes I'm commissioned. Like last year, I did a shoot for Emirates where I went out to Dubai Desert for 2 weeks to shoot their 2025 wildlife calendar, which was obviously nothing to do with me or my platform. I was just hired as a photographer to go and shoot for someone else. So there's lots of different ways that you can diversify to make sure that you're earning money. And I think it's just about being creative and looking at like different ways to make sure you're securing a financially stable future for yourself online, rather than relying on the next brand deal to keep you going and keeping you afloat. In terms of advice for anyone wanting to follow a similar path, especially if you're not someone that is typically seen in one of these roles, like typically this industry is dominated by men. There are amazing communities out there and amazing opportunities like bursaries and grant schemes for all different people. Like I'm personally part of a wildlife camera women community where people share resources, they share knowledge, there's mentorship programs. So I think anything like that that's helping you gain knowledge, gain access to resources, and using those tools that are available to you to kind of allow yourself those opportunities that you need to get further in this career is really important, and it's really going to help you be able to access the tools that you do need to be able to grow. The difficulty about being a freelancer in this world is that there's very little rules or regulations or like set rates in place, which means a lot of the time it's adapting and learning, but I think it can be quite difficult working with some brands who don't have an understanding of that. Like ultimately, if you're creating content, there's been so much time put into that. It's not just that one piece that you're creating for that brand. It's all of the years that you've spent like developing and working on your camera skills, building an audience that are going to have an interest in that brand. There's so much time that goes into it. That's not just that one piece of content. So I think it's really important to know your value and know when to say no to something and when to walk away. Because a lot of the times in this space, you will be approached with opportunities that are not paid and they're on a gifted basis. And I think it's really important to look at those things on a case-for-case basis and evaluating, is that worth my time and my energy? Because ultimately, if you're doing something for free, for me that means I could also be doing something else for free, right? I could be spending time with my family, I could be spending time with my dogs, I could be going and doing a project that wasn't a work project. I could be doing anything else with that time rather than committing that free time to someone else. So I think it's really important to look at each of those opportunities and decide, is that worth it? Sometimes I'd say it is, if you get to go on an amazing trip that you've always dreamed of, if you're being gifted an expensive piece of camera kit that you would have otherwise had to pay. But sometimes if it's a smaller item that's not even going to cover the hours it takes you to shoot that content, let alone the advertising cost, it's really important to, I think, advocate for yourself and for other creatives and know when to say, no, actually, that's not okay. Because I think the industry is growing and changing, and the more people that do advocate for that, the less it's going to happen, because ultimately you wouldn't go and work in a shop down the road for free because it's illegal. So why should you do that online? And I think it's really important to remember that and start carving out those boundaries for yourself as a creative in this industry. I absolutely love what I do, and I'm so grateful to be able to do it. I wouldn't change it for the world, but I think it is important to recognize that it does come with sacrifice. Like with all the travel that I do, I miss key things in my friends and loved ones' lives. I miss weddings, birthdays, babies being born. I'm not there for that because I'm away doing something amazing, but that is part of it. Similarly, I don't work 9 to 5. I work whenever is required of me, especially if I'm on a shoot. I could be up at 3 o'clock in the morning, out until 9 p.m. in the evening, then having to log my footage, cut and edit for the next day. Sometimes I'm working around the clock, sometimes I'm working every day. And I think that is the reality of being freelance and working for yourself, especially in this industry. Like, there's not clear-cut hours when you're working with wildlife that's active at certain times of day. So although it's incredible, I think it's important to remember that like it does come with hard work, and you have to be willing to put in that time and those hours in the field to ultimately get where you want to be from it, and to get the shots that you're wanting to get to grow and build your career. I hope that was helpful and that kind of answered any questions that you may have about my personal path. But if I did miss anything, or if there's anything you want more information on, please do comment below and I'll do my best to get back to you and share any additional resources that I can.